Every war on this list but one was caused by the war before it, not by an old grudge, or a bad king, or a border nobody could agree on, by the peace treaty. Over and over again, across 4 entire eras, the document that ends one war in Tamriel turns out to be the thing that starts the next one. A king dies in a hunting accident that isn't really an accident, and the men who take his throne pass the resentment down for generations. A god makes a bargain to keep the peace, and 2,000 years later, that same bargain tears his empire apart. A war ends with a snake bowing to a man, and the empire that snake later runs collapses into another war entirely. This isn't a theory forced onto the history. It's just what happened, stop after stop, when you lay the wars out in the order they actually occurred. That's what this is. 18 wars, told straight through, from the shattering of the first worlds down to the war that hasn't been resolved yet, the one still bleeding into the present day. Some of these come from real battle reports with named generals and dated battles. Some of them come from creation myths that nobody ever meant as history, and those get flagged as myths, plainly, when they come up. Some come from books that are openly fiction, written by in-world authors who admit they made things up to fill gaps. All of it gets told in order, because the order is the whole point. Each war grows out of the wreckage the last one left behind. Start at the beginning. Before Tamriel existed, before Men or Mer existed, there was Anu and there was Padome, and depending on which account you believe, everything else follows from what happened between them. This next part comes from a text called the Anuad, and it needs to be said clearly up front. The Anuad is a creation myth, not a battle report. Nobody was standing there with a quill taking notes. It's a story the elves and men of Tamriel told about where they came from, and different races tell it differently. But it's the oldest war on the list, so it goes first. According to the Anuad, there were once 12 worlds, and Padmai shattered them. Out of that wreckage, Anu formed Nirn, the world that would become Tamriel and everything on it. 2 races survived the shattering, and were carried into this new world along with the broken pieces of their old home, the Elnofey and the Hist. The Hist would go on to become the 3 gods of the Argonians in Black Marsh. The Elnofey would become something else, and it's their story that turns into the first war. The word Elnofey is usually translated as earth bones. Some versions of the story split that word into 2 groups. One group, called Earthbones outright, gave themselves up completely and became the actual laws of nature, the way a spirit named Ifre later did for the Bosmer. The other group held something back and had children instead, and both Men and Mer trace their ancestry back to those children. Elves mostly take that literally. It's where the elven word for their own gods, Aedra, comes from. It just means ancestor. Most human religions tell it differently. Outside of the Red Guards, men mostly call themselves creations of the Elnofi. The elves call themselves children of them. Same starting myth, and the 2 readings of it still color a lot of what Men and Mer argue about eras later. A different telling of this same beginning shows up in Aldmeri myth, and some who study both versions think it may simply be the same war seen from the other side. In that version, a spirit named Lorcan talks the other gods into building the mortal world in the first place, then gathers up the weakest of the newly made souls and names them men, leading them to war against a rival named Auriel and his own people, who become the Aldmer. Trinimac, remembered as the greatest of Auriel's knights, is said to have knocked Lorcan down in front of his own army and torn out his divine heart with his bare hands. That heart is the same heart of Lorcan that turns up again, buried under a mountain in Morrowind, in a war only a few stops from here. Whether the Aelnofe War and the Lorcan Auriel War are one event told twice, or two different stories that grew to look alike over time, is one more thing nobody has settled. One group of the Aelnofe landed together and landed lucky. They kept a big, mostly whole chunk of their old home with them, and they set up there and tried to live the way they always had. That place became known as Old Elnofe, and it would eventually be called Tamriel. The other group of Elnofe wasn't so lucky. They got scattered when the 12 worlds broke apart, thrown across the new world in pieces, and they had to wander for a long time just to find each other again. Eventually, they did find each other, the scattered wanderers and the ones who'd landed together in Old Elnofe. The wanderers were overjoyed. They'd found their own kind again after who knows how long apart. But the people of Old Elnofe didn't feel the same way. They looked at the wanderers and saw something fallen, degenerate, corrupted by however many years of struggling to survive out in a broken new world with nothing handed to them. The people of Old Elnofe still had their splendor. The wanderers had scars. War broke out between them. Nobody left behind a clean account of why, exactly, the meeting turned to violence instead of a homecoming. But it did. On one side stood Old Elnofe, mightier, better equipped, but fewer in number. On the other side stood the wanderers, weaker in raw power, maybe, but far more numerous, and hardened by everything they'd already survived just to get there. The fighting reshaped the face of the world. Whole stretches of land sank beneath new oceans. Much of the Hist's original homeland, wherever that had been, was destroyed in the process. When the war finally burned itself out, what was left standing were the continent's people in Tamriel still live on today. Tamriel itself, grown out of the wreck of Old Elnofe, and Akavir, Atmora, and Yokuda, where the scattered wanderers ended up. Over generations, the descendants of both sides of that war became the different races of men and mare that filled the rest of this story. That's the myth. Nobody can confirm a word of it happened the way it's told, but it's the war Tamriel's own people point to as the beginning, so it's the one this story starts with. The same myth adds one more detail. Before both groups of Elnofi disappeared from the world, they are said to have taken on students, and those students have been theorized to be the Dwemer, the deep elves who leave their own mark on this story a little further on. Their teachers are supposedly the reason later races called them dwarves, even though the Dwemer never much resembled small folk in build. None of this is confirmed either. It's one more piece of a myth that was never meant to be read as a battle report in the first place. Skip forward, past the Merithic era, past the founding of the Elven kingdoms, into the First Era proper, and you land in Skyrim, at a place called Sarthal. Sarthal was the first city built by humans in Skyrim, founded by settlers who'd crossed the sea from Atmora under a leader named Gisgramor. For a while it stood, then one night it burned. A snow elf force attacked Sarthal and destroyed it. The event is remembered as the Night of Tears, sometimes the Crying Night, and it drove Ysgramor to raise an army and push the elves entirely out of Solstheim and Skyrim in response. That much is agreed on. What isn't agreed on, at all, is why the elves attacked in the first place. Nobody really knows. The record doesn't say, and the two leading explanations point in opposite directions. One theory says the elves found something buried underneath Sarthal, something powerful, and burned the city to the ground so they could take it for themselves without a human population in the way. That theory gets some support from what happened centuries later, when the College of Winterhold dug through those same ruins and pulled out an artifact called the Eye of Magnus, a dangerous, ancient object. So maybe there was something worth killing for down there all along. The other theory comes from Imperial scholars, writing long after the fact, and it says something much simpler and much less interesting. The elves were afraid. Afraid that this new human culture, still young, still rough, would eventually grow to outshine their own. So, they burned it down before it had the chance. Both explanations survive in the record side by side, and neither one has ever been confirmed. That's really all there is to say about the Night of Tears. The sources on it are thin, and there isn't much more buried in them than that one open question. The push itself ended years later on Solstheim at the Battle of the Mosering, where the Snow Elves made their last stand and their leader, remembered only as the Snow Prince, was killed. What matters for the rest of this story is what came out of it. Wisegrimer's war against the elves became the founding legend of the Nords, the reason the companions exist as an order today, and the reason elf and enemy sat close together in the Nordic mind for a very long time afterward. Move south now, out of Skyrim and down into Cyrodiil, where the next war starts with slavery. By the 3rd century of the First Era, the elves who ruled Cyrodiil, the Aelids, had built an empire on the backs of enslaved humans. The Aelids called themselves the Heartland High Elves, and they ran their territory as a loose collection of city-states, all of them nominally under a High King who sat at White Gold Tower, all of them constantly jockeying against each other for power. Somewhere along the way, a religious split had pushed the empire toward its cruelest years. One faction of Aelids kept worshipping the Aedra, the old, more orderly gods. Another faction leaned hard into Daedra worship, and Aelid society under that faction got markedly darker. Slaves tortured and sacrificed to Daedric princes in exchange for armies of Daedra and other advantages. The Aelids were the first people on Tamriel to ever build an empire at all, older than any elven kingdom that came after them, and White Gold Tower itself started out as something they called the Temple of the Ancestors, raised in imitation of a tower out of their own oldest myths. Under the Daedra worshipping faction, individual Aelid cities built their own specialties in cruelty, some for wheels built to make victims wail, some for gardens grown out of the remains of the dead, others for turning captives into living sculpture. It was under that regime that a slave named Alessia decided she'd had enough. Alessia rebelled. She prayed to the Aedra, the same gods her captors had turned away from, and according to the stories, she was granted their favor. She built an army out of other enslaved people, found a demigod ally in a warrior named Morihaus, and picked up an even stranger ally in a wandering nomad warrior named Pelinal Whitestrake, who reportedly showed up at her camp one day already covered in Aelid blood. With momentum building, Alessia's forces took control of Cyrodiil east of the Niben River, then found outside help. The First Empire of the Nords, up in Skyrim, saw an opportunity and allied with her. Several Aelid city-states, unhappy with the Daedra worshipping faction running things, defected to her side too, which turned the whole conflict into as much an Aelid civil war as a slave revolt. Pelinal's own history is murkier than the tidy story of him showing up covered in Aelid blood suggests. Some accounts claim he had already spent ages wandering Tamriel before that, conquering kingdoms under a string of different names, ruling briefly, then abandoning each one to wander off again, never staying long enough to unite anything he took. Whether all of those stories describe one man or several men, remembered as one, is not something anyone has settled. What the war itself shows is more concrete. Pelinal killed a string of Aelid sorcerer kings in single combat as the rebellion spread, among them Haromir of Copper and Tea, Gordhaur the Shaper, and the lord remembered as the Fire King Hadhul. He also suffered spells of madness that came over him without warning, and by most accounts they started after a woman he loved. A former slave named Huna was killed by an Aelid archer. One of the men who served under him through the fighting was a soldier named Vilius Tharn, remembered in what fragments survive of the record as blade serrator and master of the abattoir, and later generations of the Tharn family would go on claiming descent from him. In his worst rages, Pellinol was said to cut through land as much as through people, and Alessia reportedly had to plead with the gods more than once to keep them from abandoning him over it. In one of those rages, he mistook a band of Khajiit for another kind of elf and killed a number of them before a being called Alkosh stepped in and drove him out of Elsewhere entirely, tearing a wound in time itself in the process. It was, by every surviving account, a mistake, and it is remembered in Elsewhere as one, whatever else Pellinal is remembered for Elsewhere. Umaril, the sorcerer king Pellinal eventually killed at White Gold Tower, held authority over the other sorcerer kings, not an ordinary lord among equals. He claimed a divine father as well as a mortal Aelid mother, which made him, by his own account, more than fully elf and more than fully man. He served the Daedric Prince Meridia as her favored champion, commanding her Aurorans alongside his own Aelid armies, and before the rebellion ever reached his gates, he had already led campaigns into Black Marsh and against Khajiiti traders in Elsewhere. None of that saved him. When Pellinol finally forced the fight Umaril himself had called for, it cost both of them everything they had left. It all came down to White Gold Tower. Alessia's coalition forces encircled the Aelid capital, and while the main army hesitated to storm it, Pellinal Whitestrake didn't wait around. He stormed the tower alone and killed the Aelid sorcerer king, Umaril the Unfeathered, in single combat. Pellinal died doing it. Some accounts say the Aelids, obsessed as they were with the number 8, cut his body into 8 pieces afterward, as a mockery of the very gods Alessia had prayed to. Mori House arrived with the rest of the army soon after and finished taking the tower. Alessia declared herself empress. It was 242 to 243 of the First Era, and it was the birth of the first human empire ever to hold Cyrodiil. Alessia isn't actually a birth name. It's a corruption of a title her followers gave her, Al-Esh, meaning something close to High Highness, first shouted at her, by one account, the moment her own people saw her flying over the battle on the back of Mori House. A second title, Paravant, meaning the first, sits behind a string of other names she is known by in different accounts, Perif, Paraval, Peretu, and others, all worn down from the same 2 words over time. The Aelids she overthrew had their own name for her, and it was not a kind one. They called her the Cattle Queen, a slur meant to remind everyone, hers included, that she had been property not long before she was an empress. That's the war. But the interesting part of this stop isn't the war, it's what Alessia did the moment the fighting stopped, because that decision is the one that echoes across the rest of this whole story. Alessia had just won her throne with 2 very different groups of allies. Her own people, the freed slaves of Cyrodiil, had spent generations under Aelid rule and had picked up the Aelid religion along the way, the worship of the Aldmeri gods, whatever their captors' faults. Meanwhile, her Nordic allies from Skyrim followed a completely different pantheon, the Nordic gods, and had zero interest in bowing to anything that looked elven. 2 allied races, 2 incompatible religions, sitting inside one new empire that had just been forged in blood, left alone. That's not a stable situation. That's the seed of the next civil war. So Alessia didn't leave it alone. She built a new religion on purpose, specifically to keep that war from happening. She took elements of the Aldmeri pantheon her own people already knew and fused them with elements of the Nordic pantheon her allies followed, and out of that fusion came the 8 divines, later The 9, once a certain conquering emperor got added to the list generations down the line. It wasn't an accident of faith. It was a political fix, engineered to hold two cultures together under one roof by giving them one shared set of gods to kneel to instead of two competing ones. The deeper theology of what that religion actually claimed about the world and about the covenant her descendants would later strike with the dragon god Akatosh belongs to a different story. What belongs to this one is simpler. Alessia looked at the seam running down the middle of her new empire and welded it shut with a religion built for the purpose. It worked for a while. It is the first clean example of the pattern that runs through the rest of this story. The peace that ends one war plants the next one. Alessia made Sankretor her holy city, the place where she said Akatosh had first appeared to her, and she was buried there when she died in the year 266 of the First Era, at least by the tradition that later Riemann emperors adopted for their own burials in those same catacombs. A rival tradition puts her grave in the imperial city instead, under what later became the Temple of the One, and nobody has ever settled which version is correct. She also had a son, Belharza, fathered by Morihaus, and some accounts credit that pairing as the origin of the Minotaur race entirely, with Belharza as its first member. Belharza went on to succeed his mother as the second emperor of Serodil. None of that is settled history either. It got passed down because Alessia was the kind of figure people wanted a legend attached to. Around the year 700 of the First Era, up in the mountains of what would become Morrowind, that pattern showed up again, and this time the casualties weren't measured in dead bodies. They were measured in an entire race disappearing. Before this war, the Chimer and the Dwemer weren't enemies. They were allies, and more than that, in some cases, they were friends. The Dwemer, the Deep Elves, lived underground in vast stone cities, working reason and engineering the way other races worked faith. The Chimer, ancestors of the modern Dunmer, were nomadic tribes and great houses who worshipped the Daedra the Dwemer had no time for. They had not always lived in Morrowind. They arrived by choice, generations earlier, following a mystic named Veloth out of the Somerset Isles after he rejected the Aldmer gods in favor of a handful of Daedra his followers called the Good Daedra, Boethia, Azura, and Mephala. Veloth's people crossed the sea and climbed mountains to reach a harsh, ash-covered land nobody else wanted, and built a civilization there anyway. That founding walk is why the Chimer and the Dunmer, who came after them, are still called Veloti. The two races had fought before, back when they were first settling the same territory, but everything changed when the Nords invaded around the year 240 of the First Era under King Vrage the Gifted. Facing a common enemy pushing into their land, the Dwemer King, Dumag Dwarf King, and the Chimer war leader, Indoril Nerevar, put their differences aside and became friends. Together, they drove the Nords out of Morrowind entirely by the year 416 of the First Era, and out of that victory they built something new, a joint Dwemer-Chimer state called Razdain, run by a council of both races known as the First Council. The friendship between the two kings ran deeper than politics. Dumak gave Nerevar and his new wife, Almalexia, a pair of enchanted swords as wedding gifts, Hope's Fire and True Flame, and gave Sotasil a wing of an old Dwemer facility called Kemelze as a mark of the alliance, a gift Sotasil would later use to start work on what became the Clockwork City. The two kings even traveled together to Serodil in the year 461 to attend an imperial coronation as joint representatives of their new state, a display of unity that nobody watching would have predicted a generation earlier. Nerevar, for his part, wore a ring called Moon and Star, blessed by the Daedric prince Azura, so that it would kill anyone who put it on except him. He used that ring to swear to the nomadic Ashlander tribes of Morrowind that he would always respect their way of life, and an oath sworn on a ring nobody else could safely wear was enough to win their loyalty for the war still to come. That alliance held for generations. Then it broke, and at the center of the break was a Dwemer named Kagrenak. Kagrenak was the Dwemer's chief tonal architect, their equivalent of a high priest and a master engineer rolled into one, and deep under Red Mountain his people had found something extraordinary, the heart of Lorkhan, the actual, physical divine center of a dead god, still beating, still radiating power nobody fully understood. Kagrenak designed 3 tools to work on it: a gauntlet called Wraithguard, meant to protect whoever wore it, and a hammer and a blade called Sunder and Keening, meant to strike the heart and shape the power that came out of it. Generations later, the very last living Dwemer anyone would ever meet, a scholar named Yagrum Bagarn, would say he understood Kagrenak's full theories on how it was all supposed to work, and would also say he intended to let that understanding die with him rather than explain it to anyone else. Kagrenak believed that with the right tools, tuned to the right tones, that heart could be used to build a god of the Dwemer's own making. He called the project Anumidium. Most of Tamriel would later just call it Numidium, and it would go on to reshape continents. But that's a different stop in this story. What matters here is that word of Kagrenak's project reached Nerevar, and Nerevar considered it blasphemy. Depending on which account you trust, Dumak either knew about his High Craftlord's scheme and lied to his old friend's face about it, or genuinely didn't know and was blindsided by the accusation. Either way, the friendship that had held the alliance together collapsed, and Nerevar led the Chimer to war against the people who used to fight beside them. The war climaxed at what's remembered as the Battle of Red Mountain, and here the sources stop agreeing with each other almost entirely. Every account agrees that Chimer forces under Nerevar, joined by Nordic and Orc armies with their own reasons for wanting a piece of the fight, clashed with the Dwemer under Dumak at Dumak's own citadel inside the mountain, where the heart of Lorkhan was kept. Every account agrees that by the time the fighting ended, the entire Dwemer race, every single one of them, everywhere on Nirn, had vanished. Dumak was dead. Nerevar was dead or dying, and the Dwemer were simply gone. What actually caused that disappearance is where the story splits into pieces that don't fit back together. One version says Kagrenak used his tools on the heart of Lorkhan in the heat of battle, out of desperation, and the attempt to make a god out of it erased his entire people from existence instead. Another version, favored by the Ashlander tribes who never accepted the religion that grew out of this war, says it was Nerevar himself, with help from the Daedric prince Azura, who destroyed the Dwemer on purpose. A different Nordic telling has the god Shor's ghost, ridden into battle by a resurrected king named Wulfharth, crushing the Dwemer under the mountain itself. There's physical evidence that gets pointed to on all sides. In the undisturbed Dwemer ruins beneath the city of Mournhold, ash piles sit next to armor and weapons exactly where their owners had been standing, as though whole people turned to dust between one heartbeat and the next, with no time even to react. That much, at least, nobody disputes. What caused it is still argued over, centuries later, by scholars who have nothing else to go on but a handful of contradictory sermons, and a lot of ash. Some accounts tie the battle to something remembered as the sun's death, a catastrophic eruption of Red Mountain itself around the same time, one that blotted out the sun over Morrowind for a full year and coated the sky in ash. Whether the eruption caused the disappearance, followed it, or simply happened alongside it by grim coincidence is one more thing nobody has managed to pin down. None of the theories can be confirmed. Not one. That deserves to be said plainly. because this may be the single largest casualty event on this entire list, and it isn't even a body count anyone can point to. A whole race of people, cities full of them, spread across an entire province, blinked out of the world in what might have been a single instant, and 4,000 years later, nobody can say for certain what happened or why. Out of the wreckage, 3 of Nerevar's lieutenants, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotasil, used Kagernak's abandoned tools to make living gods of themselves, and built a new religion, the Tribunal Temple, around their own divinity. Voren Dagoth, the head of the Dwemer-sympathizing house Dagoth, was branded a traitor, and his house dissolved into the others. That's the shape of the war itself. 2 allies who'd loved each other enough to drive out a shared enemy, torn apart by one man's ambition to build a god, ending with an entire people erased and 3 men crowning themselves divine on top of the ashes. The war that came right after this one didn't grow out of Red Mountain directly. It grew out of Skyrim, and it came from religion again. The same religion Alessia had built 2 centuries earlier to hold her empire together. By the middle of the First Era, the first empire of the Nords, under King Vrage's descendants, had become a real power, pushing its borders out from Skyrim in what's remembered as the Skyrim conquests, underway since the year 240. Within about 50 years, the Nords held most of High Rock and the whole of Morrowind, right up until Nerevar and Dumak drove them out in the year 416, as already told. The Nords also stayed close allies with the Alessian Empire down in Cyrodiil, embracing Alessia's new 8 divines even where it was controversial back home in Skyrim. That alliance held together for generations, right up until a fundamentalist offshoot of Alessia's religion, called the Alessian Order, started pushing hard against anything Elven anywhere. High King Borgas of Skyrim was a supporter of the Alessian Order, and in the year 369 of the First Era, he wanted to join the Order in an invasion of Valenwood, home of the Bosmer. The Bosmer had other plans. Using an ancient rite called the Wild Hunt, they killed Borgas before the invasion ever got off the ground. Borgas died without an heir, ending the line of Ysgramor's descendants that had ruled Skyrim since the beginning, and the Moot, the council responsible for choosing a new High King, simply failed to pick one. Borgas's body was thought lost on the battlefield at first. It was not. Skyrim recovered it and buried it in the tomb at Korvanjund instead, without any public announcement that it had even been found. Imperial scholars later blamed the Moot for this, saying flatly that the obvious choice had been sitting right there, Jarl Hansa of Winterhold. It's worth being honest about that claim, because it comes from a partisan source. Imperial scholars had their own reasons to want a clean, simple explanation for a mess that dragged Skyrim into 51 years of civil war, and the Moot was foolish enough to overlook the obvious man is a much tidier story than whatever tangle of Nordic politics actually kept the throne empty. Whatever the real reason, no High King was chosen, and Skyrim tore itself apart from the year 369 to 420 of the First Era. The cost was almost everything the Skyrim conquests had won. By the year 401, Skyrim had lost its holdings in both High Rock and Morrowind. Cities inside Skyrim itself, including Windhelm, were sacked. High Rock slipped out of Nordic hands and into the control of the Direni elves. And Morrowind, already lost to the new Dwemer-Chimer alliance in 416 as told a moment ago, stayed lost for good. The war finally ended in 420 with something called the Pact of Chieftains, and a new High King, Olaf One-Eye, took the throne after subduing a dragon named Numinex and locking it away beneath Whiterun. 51 years of fighting over an empty chair had cost Skyrim 2 provinces and left the kingdom permanently smaller than it had been when Borgas rode out to his death. One more thing came out of those 51 years, quieter than a lost province but longer lasting. A Nord named Jürgen Windcaller spent 7 years in meditation trying to understand how the Thu'um, the Nordic voice, could have failed to save Morrowind from the Chimerdwemer alliance a few generations earlier. He came out of it believing the voice was a gift from kind meant only for worship. When other Nords pushed back on that idea, he reportedly shouted down every objection they raised and founded the Greybeards on the mountain of High Hrothgar on the strength of that belief, an order that still guards the voice in Skyrim eras later. The war also split Skyrim itself roughly along an eastern and western line, a divide that outlasted the war that drew it. While Skyrim was busy losing a civil war over its own succession, an entirely different kind of war was unfolding across the sea, and this one wasn't about an empire tearing itself apart. It was about a people showing up on someone else's shore in waves, one after another, until there was nobody left of the people who'd lived there before. The people were the Yokudans, ancestors of the modern Redguards, and their homeland of Yokuda was, by most accounts, already coming apart at the seams from internal wars of its own by the time they started leaving. Around the year 780 of the First Era, a swordmaster named Frandar Hunding led the surviving Yokudan sword singers, fewer than 20,000 of them, east across the ocean toward Tamriel. They called themselves the Ra Gada, the warrior wave, and what followed was 4 separate waves of colonization spread out over roughly a century, each one bloodier and more thorough than the last. The land they landed on wasn't empty, it was Hammerfell, and Hammerfell already had people living in it, a human population the sources called the Nedis, who knew the region as the Deathlands. The Nedis there had already survived incursions from 2 different directions before the Ragada ever arrived. Aelid slavers had raided them. Dwemer clans, expanding west after their falling out with the Chimer, had dismissed them as backward savages, not worth taking seriously as rivals. The Nedis had endured both, the way people who leave somewhere for generations tend to endure whoever passes through. They had their own kings, 9 of them under one high king named Durak, and their own religion, built around watching and studying the stars. None of it saved them. They did not endure the Ragada. The first wave, led by Hunding himself, fought the goblin tribes of the region and took the Alikr Desert. The descendants of this wave would become the forebear faction of the modern Redguards. The second wave arrived around the time Yokuda itself was destroyed back home, bringing the old Yokudan aristocracy, who would become the crown faction. They landed first on the island of Herne, wiping out its Nedic population, before spreading across Hammerfell's southern and western coasts. Hern's own Nedic chief, a war chief named Hakon, fought them anyway, and the record still remembers his stand as a brave one, even though it changed nothing about how the battle ended. The third wave found the Iliac Bay and settled Sentinel and the northern coast, and its corsairs raided as far as High Rock before the Direni sorcery drove them back. The fourth wave was remembered as the bloodiest of all 4, and it's the one credited with the final disappearance of the Nedic population from Hammerfell altogether, though some sources note the Nedis may already have been in decline before that wave even landed. One band within that last wave, led by a commander named Tarish Z, pushed all the way into the remote region of Craglorn, the last corner of Hammerfell where Nedic culture still held on, and finished there what the rest of the invasion had already done everywhere else. That's what an invasion looks like from the shore, when you're the one already standing on it. 4 separate waves spread across a century, and Nedic Hammerfell simply isn't there anymore by the time the last wave rolls in. the Ragada didn't stop at the mainland either. Out in the Sisters archipelago lived the last of the left-handed elves, survivors of a people who had fought the Yokudans on Yokuda itself for 1,000 years before any of this ever started. An empire that at its height is said to have been 4 times the size of the entire Third Empire that would one day rule all of Tamriel. Yokudan legend says that fight only turned once. A spirit called Diagna gave the Yokudans weapons forged from Orichalk, and that at a place remembered as the Orichalk Tower, swords fell from its walls to arm them like needles falling from a dry pine. Beaten off their own continent generations earlier, the left-handed elves had themselves invaded the Sisters around the year 660 of the First Era, fighting the native Breton druids there for years until a volcano, Mount Firesong, erupted and burned through both sides at once, leaving the elves in control of whatever was left standing. That is who the Ragada found waiting on those islands when the first wave landed in the year 785. Elves who had survived 1,000 years of war with the Yokudans, survived the loss of their own continent, and survived the volcano, did not survive the Ragada. Redguards still don't talk about the left-handed elves much today. The Ragada's hatred of elves ran deep enough that even remembering them is treated as something better left alone. Not every people the Yokudans found on Tamriel's shores went down as quickly. Up in the Rothgarian mountains, a different group entirely was about to prove that, and prove it for 3 full decades. The orcs of Orsinium had built themselves a capital, and to the Bretons and Redguards around them, that capital was an insult just by existing. Orcish civilization, in the eyes of most of Tamriel, was beneath contempt, a rumor more than a nation. Orsinium said otherwise. In response to the threat the growing Orc kingdom posed to the Breton kingdom of Wayrest, an alliance of Bretons, Redguards, and Yokudans formed to bring Orsinium down, and they laid siege to it, starting in the year 948 of the First Era. The siege lasted until the year 980, 3 full decades. A person could be born the year that siege started and have grown children of their own by the time it ended. An entire generation could live and die camped outside a city its besiegers considered too low even to bother naming properly, fighting the same war their parents had started before they themselves were born. That's the whole point of this stop. Not a clever battle, not a famous general, just the plain fact of a siege longer than most people's working lives. Thrown at a capital, its enemies never respected enough to imagine taking seriously in the first place. When it finally fell in the year 980, the first Orsinium was destroyed. It would not be the last Orsinium. The orcs would rebuild more than once in the centuries still to come. Back in Serodil, the religion Alessia had built to hold 2 races together was still standing, more than 1,000 years after her death. It had outlasted her immediate dynasty, and calcified into something much harder and much less forgiving than what she'd started with, the Alessian Order, a fundamentalist priesthood that ran much of the Alessian Empire's political life alongside its spiritual life. And by the 24th century of the First Era, that priesthood had grown so large, so fast, that it couldn't support its own weight anymore. The War of Righteousness, fought from the year 2321 to 2331 of the First Era, wasn't started by an invasion. No foreign army crossed the border to set it off. It came from inside the order itself, from what was essentially an unsustainable hiring problem. The priesthood had expanded far beyond what it could actually govern or fund, and the strain of that overreach started cracking the empire at every seam. Distant territories saw their chance and took it. High Rock had already broken away years earlier over the Order's anti-elven excesses. Then, when Western Cyrodiil isolated itself and set up its own autonomous government, the Colovian estates, tensions that had been simmering under the surface, finally boiled into open war. The fighting spread into Breton lands in the Iliac Bay, and it went badly for the order almost everywhere. An entire legion sent to put down the Bretons was wiped out at the Bancorai garrison, a defeat that only emboldened the rebelling Colovians further. The financial strain of the war forced the Colovian estates to sell off territory just to keep fighting. Back in the Order's own heartland, the cost of the war in the west led to heavier taxes and conscription in the east, in Nibenai, and the Nibenese responded by rising up, killing the Order's archprelate and burning down its great cathedral. With no leadership left and no money coming in, the Alessian armies fighting in High Rock simply gave up and went home. A decade of fighting had killed off half the population of the Iliac Bay, and it ended with the Alessian order dissolved entirely, and Cyrodiil left divided under a puppet emperor until a new unifying figure finally showed up generations later. Here's the callback worth stating plainly, because it's the cleanest example in this whole story of the pattern repeating itself over centuries instead of just decades. Alessia had invented a religion specifically to prevent a war, to weld two allied races together so their differences wouldn't tear her new empire apart. It worked. And roughly 2,000 years later, that same religion, grown into an empire-spanning priesthood with more power than any government could safely hold, is exactly what tore the empire apart instead. The fix became the fracture. Nobody planned that outcome. It just took 2 millennia to arrive. Cyrodiil was still picking up the pieces of that collapse when, in the year 2700, 3 of the First Era ships started arriving from the east that nobody in Tamriel had ever properly dealt with before. This is the turn most people already know something about, even if they've never heard the rest of this list, and it earns its place here too. A large armada of Tsaeski, the serpent folk of Akavir, landed on Tamriel's northern coast and marched south and west through Morrowind and Skyrim, beating everything in their path, heading for the Geralt Mountains. Akavir itself was close to a blank spot on Tamriel's own maps at the time, and in a lot of ways it still is. What little was known held that the continent had 4 separate nations on it: the serpent folk Tsaeski, a snow-dwelling people called the Kamal, a tiger-like folk called the Kapotun, and a monkey folk called the Tangmo, and that no mare had ever lived there at all, only men and beast folk. Dragons were said to come from Akavir too, or maybe from Atmora, depending on which old story got asked. 2 of those 4 nations, the Tsaeski and the tiger folk Kapotun, counted each other as their worst enemies, and word on Akavir held that the Kapotun were waiting for the day they finally beat the Tsashi so they could turn their own attention to Tamriel next. The 4th nation, a monkey folk called the Tangmo, had a simpler reputation. Every other people on Akavir had tried to conquer them at one point or another, and every single attempt had failed. The source's own caveat is worth naming here. Before this invasion, the handful of earlier Akaviri appearances on Tamriel, going back roughly to the year 800 of the First Era, are now generally assumed to have simply been pirates and scouts. Raiders who set up on islands off Wayrest and were counted as ordinary enemies of the Bretons, not the leading edge of an invasion. This time was different. This was the real thing, and it very nearly went badly for all of Tamriel, rather than just for the Akaviri. Legions of raiders had already struck northern Tamriel around the year 2700, forcing the population of Wayrest to crowd inside the city's own walls for safety the year before this larger armada landed, and High Rock's Iliac Bay region had already been cut in half a third time over by the damage. Some accounts go so far as to say that if Daggerfall hadn't spent its first 1,000 years building up its own fortifications, the whole Iliac Bay might have ended up permanently Akaviri rather than Brittonic. The Tsaishi made one mistake on their way through, though. They marched through Morrowind first, and in doing so, they drew the attention of Vivek, one of the living gods, who ruled there since the Battle of Red Mountain 2,000 years earlier. Vivek allied with the Dru, sea-dwelling creatures with their own kings, and struck the Akaviri from behind, cutting off their supply lines and their route back to the sea. Stranded and starving, the Tsayeshi dug in at a defensible position called Pale Pass, where they finally met the army of a newly united Cyrodiil, commanded by a man named Riemann. And then, something strange happened. Riemann's army had only just begun its advance into the mountains when the entire Akaviri force abruptly surrendered, not after a crushing defeat, not after running out of options. They knelt before Riemann and told him they had found what they'd come to Tamriel looking for. The turn everyone remembers is exactly this. The Akaviri lost, and then they joined. Riemann folded the surviving Tsaiski veterans directly into his own armies and his personal service, and they became the Dragon Guard, hunting the dragons that Tsaiski had crossed an ocean to find in the first place. Centuries later, the Dragon Guard's descendants would become the Blades, an organization that would go on to serve Dragonborn emperors for the rest of Tamriel's recorded history. Riemann used his newly reinforced army and the Akaviri's discipline and tactics to conquer nearly every remaining province of Tamriel except Morrowind, whose living gods he'd already made peace with. Even the Somerset Isles, wary of a human empire finding its feet again after everything the Akaviri had just proven it could do, ended up under Riemann's thumb, though the arrangement there looked more like tribute paid to keep the peace than outright conquest, and the Altmer used it mainly to keep the rest of Tamriel as far from their shores as they could manage. Out of that conquest came the Second Empire, and out of the Second Empire eventually came the title Riemann would be remembered by afterward. Founder of a dynasty, the man Tamriel's earliest form of the empire was actually built around. Riemann's name means Light of Man, and contrary to a mix-up that still comes up today, the province of Cyrodiil was not named after him. It went the other way. He took Cyrod, an old Aelid name for the province, and made it his own surname. Where Riemann actually came from before any of that is murkier. A fragmentary text called the Remanada claims his birth was stranger than an ordinary succession. It says a Skyrim king named Hrol was visited by the spirit of Saint Alessia herself, centuries dead by then, and that their union at Sancrator produced Riemann, in an act the story says cost Hrol his life. A shepherdess is said to have found the infant there afterward, with the amulet of kings already resting in his forehead, and carried him straight to White Gold Tower, where he was set on the throne without anyone objecting. Skeptics have always suspected the whole account was invented after the fact to make a jumped-up general's claim on the throne look like destiny instead of ambition. That skepticism is probably fair. It doesn't change how useful the story was to the dynasty that used it. Riemann ruled for decades after the Akaviri surrendered, but the alliance with Morrowind never fully settled into trust. He died in the year 2762 of the First Era, by some accounts killed by the Morag Tong, Morrowind's own guild of assassins, possibly on Vivek's order. He was buried at Sancretor, the same fortress where Alessia herself was set to rest, and it would go on holding Riemann emperors for 2 more centuries after him. Riemann's conquests didn't stop with the Akaviri, and didn't stop with Morrowind's neutrality either. His successors kept pushing, and one of those pushes turned into the longest war on this entire list, and also the strangest ending. Riemann II, one of Riemann's descendants on the throne, had just finished seizing Black Marsh for the Empire when he decided to press his luck against Morrowind next. the one province the original Riemann had always left alone. The war that followed, remembered as the Fourscore War, ran from the year 2840 to 2920 of the First Era. 80 years fought over the border regions of Morrowind, the armies of the Riemann dynasty against the tribunal-led forces of the Dunmer. Riemann II didn't live to see much of it. He died fighting the Dunmer just 3 years into his own war, in the year 2843. His successors, first Brazolus Dor, then Riemann III, kept the fighting going without him for another 77 years after his death. The war outlived the man who started it by 77 years. There's a line from a historical account of the period put in the mouth of Vivek himself that captures the mood better than any summary could. After 80 years, I don't think anyone can imagine an end. Nobody could. It just kept going, generation after generation of Riemann emperors and tribunal generals, neither side able to finish what the first Riemann had started. It ended, finally, not with a Riemann on the throne at all, but with an Akaviri. By the year 2920, the Riemann dynasty itself had been swallowed by its own Akaviri allies, and it was the Akaviri potentate Versidu Shai who signed the peace, the servant truce, directly with Vivek. The result of that truce was that Morrowind remained the only nation in all of Tamriel that stayed independent of the Second Empire, and it would stay that way right up until that empire finally collapsed in the year 430 of the Second Era. This source is thin on detail, past its own timeline, and that quote, "But the shape of it says everything that needs saying. A war that started under one Riemann, outlasted 3 more emperors and the man who first declared it, and ended with a snake signing on behalf of an empire of men, because that's exactly where the First Era leaves things. It doesn't end with a treaty signed by an emperor. It ends with a truce signed by an Akaviri potentate, a descendant of the very invaders the first Riemann had once brought to their knees at Pale Pass, ruling in the name of an empire built by men. The Second Era is what happens next, when that potentate's line runs out and there is no empire left standing at all. By the year 572 of the Second Era, that empty throne had been sitting empty for a long time. In a stretch of history, the record simply calls the interregnum no Second Empire, no Riemann line, just provinces and kingdoms managing their own affairs and their own quarrels. That was the state of things when a fleet arrived from Akavir again, and this time it wasn't the Tsaiski. It was the Kamal, a race the Akaviri themselves called the Snow Demons, sailing under a king named Adasum Dir Kamal, reportedly hunting for a person or an object referred to only as the ordained receptacle. What that phrase actually meant never made it into any surviving Tamrielic record. Whatever Adasum Dir Kamal was looking for, nobody on this side of the invasion ever found out, and the Kamal themselves never got the chance to explain. The Kamal fleet did something strange right from the start. It bypassed Morrowind entirely, sailing past the Dunmer coastline without engaging, and landed instead near Windhelm, on the eastern edge of Skyrim. Windhelm was taken completely by surprise. The city was sacked, and in the fighting to defend it, Queen Mabjarn Flamehair and her heir, Princess Nurnhilde, were both killed leading their own soldiers, a unit remembered as the Blood Claws, directly into the invaders. Nurnhilde's 2 younger brothers, twins, reached the city in the middle of the battle, but they arrived too late to save it. Fildgor Strongprince at the head of his own Stormfist brigade, and Jorun, the Skald Prince, leading a company called the Pack of Bards. Windhelm had already fallen by the time either of them got there. The twin brothers joined forces anyway, and drove the Kamal back out of the smoking city. From there, the invasion took another strange turn. Instead of continuing on to an obvious target, The Kamal army marched south, but bypassed the city of Riften entirely and pushed instead into Stone Falls in western Morrowind. Dunmer forces, under a general named Tanval of House Indoril, met them there first, and rather than risk everything on one battle, Tanval fought a slow retreat, giving ground on purpose while the Kamal advanced deeper into Dunmer territory. Meanwhile, Jorun wasn't willing to just react. He sought out the Greybeards, the reclusive monks who guard the ancient art of the voice in Skyrim, and asked them to do something almost nobody asks for: summon the dead. The Greybeards called back the spirit of Wulfharth, the legendary Ash King, and with Wulfharth's aid, Jorun rallied his forces and dug in at Riften to meet an assault that never came, because the Kamal had already moved on toward the Dunmer instead. What happened next, at a beach on the inner sea just west of Ebonheart that would afterward be named Vivek's Antlers, is the kind of battle that gets remembered detail by detail, because almost nobody expected it to go the way it went. Dunmer forces under the command of the living god Almalexia met the Camel there first and held the line, buying time while the invaders, exhausted and hoping their own fleet would arrive in time to evacuate them, kept fighting. Then Jorun arrived with his Nords, and instead of hitting the Kamal head-on, he swung his forces around into a pincer, catching the invaders between his own army and Almalexia's. Even so, the fight hung in the balance. The Nord army had overextended itself getting there, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, right up until an elite Argonian phalanx, soldiers called the Shellbacks, led by a commander named Heitamin, arrived and slammed into the Kamal's flank. That single reinforcement turned a stalemate into a slaughter, and to make sure none of the Kamal escaped by sea, Vivek himself summoned a tidal wave that finished off what was left of their fleet. 3 races, Nord, Dunmer, and Argonian, who had spent centuries hating each other for one reason or another, ended up standing on the same beach, finishing the same invasion together. The real story here isn't the battle, it's the peace that followed it. Those same 3 races, Nords of Eastern Skyrim, Dunmer of Morrowind, and Argonians of Black Marsh, formed an alliance out of the wreckage called the Ebonheart Pact, binding together nations that, by every account, had no real reason to trust each other and plenty of history telling them not to. As part of that new alliance, the Dunmer freed the Argonian slaves they had held for generations, in direct recognition of the help Argonian soldiers had given at Vivek's Antlers. Argonians themselves don't call this conflict the Second Akaviri invasion at all. They call it the Liberation War, and given what came out of it for them, it's easy to see why. But not everyone joined the pact, and the reason why matters. Western Skyrim, the other half of the Nordic homeland, sat this one out entirely. They hadn't been attacked. Windhelm and Eastern Skyrim had taken the invasion's full weight, but Western Skyrim's own cities and holds had never seen a Kamal soldier, so as far as they were concerned, there was no threat to ally against, and no reason to bind themselves to a Dunmer Argonian pact built on someone else's emergency. And Jorun's own victory, the thing that should have been his crowning moment, turned almost immediately into a war of its own. Back home in Windhelm, a succession dispute broke out between Jorun and his twin brother Fildgor, the same brother who had fought at his side against the Kamal just weeks before. The two had jointly defeated the invaders after their sister's death, but they couldn't agree on which of them should now rule or how, and Jorun ended up challenging Fildgor to single combat over it. The fight, remembered as the Brothers' War, was fought only 3 weeks after the victory at Vivek's Antlers, and Jorun won it, exiling his own twin and crowning himself Skald King of Eastern Skyrim. A war that had briefly united 3 ancient enemies against a common invader ended within a month with two brothers who had just fought side by side, turning on each other over the throne their sister left behind. 10 years after that, in the year 582 of the Second Era, the biggest war of the whole interregnum was already underway, and it was fought over something that, on paper, didn't even exist anymore: an empty throne. Three great alliances had formed across Tamriel in the years leading up to this, each one built out of the same kind of desperate, unlikely bargain that had ended the Kamal invasion. The Daggerfall Covenant came together in 566, uniting Bretons, Redguards, and Orcs. The Ebonheart Pact, born out of the fight against the Kamal, had formed in 572, as already told, and the first Aldmeri dominion of this era pulled together in 580, uniting Altmer, Bosmer, and Khajiit under Queen Iren. Each alliance had its own reasons for existing, but all three ended up pointed at the same target: Cyrodiil and the Ruby Throne sitting empty at its center, propped up by a puppet Empress Regent named Clivia Tharn, who was, in turn, being run by a necromancer named Mani Marco, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Each alliance saw a chance to march in, take the imperial city, and crown their own emperor. None of them wanted to let either of the other two do it first. Imperial writers who lived through it later called the whole mess the Usurper War, Three Queens and Kings, Aaron of the Dominion, Emmerich of the Covenant, and Joran of the Pact, all treating the throne as theirs for the taking. So, all three invaded Cyrodiil at once. The Covenant came down through the northwest from Craglorn and the Geral Mountains under a warlord named Dortine. The Pact came in through the northeast from Morrowind under a commander named Zimmeron. The Dominion pushed up from the south through Reaper's March under a commander named Sorkelin. What followed was years of siege warfare, keeps and forts changing hands over and over, the imperial city itself briefly crowned with a figurehead emperor from whichever alliance happened to be holding it at the time, only for that hold to break within weeks and the cycle to start again. Whole regions of Cyrodiil, towns that had stood for centuries, were devastated in the fighting. The Bankora garrison fell more than once. Daven's Watch in Morrowind was besieged. Oridon itself came under attack, and so did the swamps of Shadowfen in Black Marsh. One of the heaviest three-way clashes was fought again at Chalman Keep, and another round of fighting even returned to the same stretch of coast west of Ebonheart already named Vivek's Antlers after the fight against the Kamal, a beach that had now seen two different wars break across it in the same century. Each alliance built its own network of battlefield teleportation just to move troops fast enough to keep pace with the fighting, and soldiers on every side tracked down and stole Elder Scrolls that a secretive order of monks had hidden away, building shrines close enough to the front to bless troops with them before battle. Even Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness, got involved for his own entertainment, dropping his own artifact hammer onto the battlefield and watching all three armies fight over it and turn it against each other in turn. This was, by any measure, already one of the largest wars Tamriel had ever seen, and it was fought at the exact same time as something considerably worse. While the three alliances tore into each other over Cyrodiil, the Daedric Prince Molag Bal was in the middle of trying to merge the entire mortal plane of Nirn with his own realm of Oblivion, Cold Harbor, permanently and completely. This is worth saying plainly, because it's easy to let it slide past as background noise. The single most existential threat of the entire Second Era, an attempt by a Daedric prince to erase the line between the living world and his own personal hell, was happening at the very same time as the biggest war of the age, and the war did not stop for it. Armies kept marching on Cyrodiil while the sky itself was tearing open somewhere else. The plane melt as it came to be known, started with a mistake. A rebel duke named Varen Aquilarios had seized the Ruby Throne in 577 after deposing a previous, even worse emperor, and he wanted to legitimize his rule the traditional way, by relighting the dragon fires as a true dragonborn. To do that, he gathered 4 companions, among them the sorcerer Manimarco, and set out to recover the long-lost Amulet of Kings. What none of the others knew was that Manimarco was secretly serving Molag Bal. When the group finally performed their ritual in 579, Manimarco had spent weeks corrupting it in secret, and instead of relighting the dragon fires, the ritual tore the barrier between Nirn and Oblivion wide open in an event called the Soul Burst. Nirn came loose from its moorings in reality itself. Mages went mad. The ground shook as far away as Skyrim, and Molag Bal, given the opening he'd been waiting for, began dropping massive Daedric machines called Dark Anchors across the continent, each one dragging pieces of the world physically into Cold Harbor. At one point, his forces broke straight into the Imperial City in the middle of the Three Banners War's own fighting there, pouring up out of the sewers and seizing the district around White Gold Tower, while soldiers from all 3 alliances were still busy fighting each other in the streets outside. A handful of Imperial loyalists, remembered afterward as the Immortal Eight, held the line inside the city and kept Molag Bal's forces from snuffing out the dragonfires completely before anyone else could respond. In the chaos right after the Soul Burst, one of Varen's own companions, a soldier named Sai Sahan, grabbed the broken Amulet of Kings and ran, hiding it in the ruins of Sancre Tor, the old fortress where Tiber Septim himself had once been blessed by Akatosh, and it would sit buried there for the next 3 years, while the war above ground went on without it. The 2 crises ran side by side for years. While the Three Banners War chewed up Cyrodiil field by field, dark anchors kept falling, and the largest one of all took aim squarely at White Gold Tower itself, the single most important structure in the mortal realm, the linchpin the Empire's whole existence was built around. It took the leaders of all 3 warring alliances finally agreeing to meet on the neutral island of Sturg to even begin talking about a truce, and Molag Bal responded to that meeting by trying to have all 3 of them assassinated on the spot. They survived, and the shock of that attack was what finally got soldiers from the Covenant, the Pact, and the Dominion fighting alongside each other instead of against each other, at least for a while, in a joint invasion of Cold Harbor itself. Inside that realm, an old Aelid king named Laloriaran Dainar, who had been dragged there and tortured for centuries, was freed from his own cell and ended up leading part of the invasion force himself. He was fatally burned, destroying the heart of Molag Bal's power there, and never got to see the world he had just helped save. What remained of the threat was settled only when the small band who had first uncovered the plot confronted Molag Bal directly, one of their own giving up a life so the Amulet of Kings could be turned against him. The invasion succeeded. Molag Bal was forced to relinquish his hold on Nirn and was driven off, gravely weakened, though very much not destroyed. And the moment that shared threat was dealt with, the Alliance leaders went right back to fighting each other. The ceasefire had served its one purpose and nothing more. Tensions between the 3 alliances never fully resolved. No side ever definitively won the war for the Ruby Throne, and within a few centuries, all 3 alliances and the empire they'd been fighting over had ceased to exist in their old form entirely. Tamriel had just survived a Daedric prince trying to erase the world, in the middle of fighting itself half to death over a chair nobody would end up sitting in for long anyway. Proof of just how little that chair actually meant by this point. Sometime before the year 812 of the Second Era, survivors of the Kamal invasion force that was supposed to have been wiped out entirely at Vivek's antlers turned up again, deep inside Cyrodiil, and somehow managed to seize the ruby throne outright. Akaviri exiles from Rimmon, who had fled there years earlier to escape an old warlord's persecution, joined them, and together the two groups of exiles tried to rebuild the empire from the throne they had just captured. It didn't work. Whatever they built collapsed just as fast as everything else that had tried to fill that same empty chair. Out of all that chaos, one man finally did what nobody else had managed since the fall of the Riemann line. He unified the whole continent, and he did it with a weapon nobody else even knew still worked. It started small, the way most of these stories start. A Colovian warlord named Cuchulainn wanted to unify the Colovian estates under his own banner, and his best general, a young Nord named Hjalti Earlybeard, was doing most of the actual fighting for him. At the Battle of Old Hroldan, Hjalti reportedly used the ancient Nordic voice itself to shout down the walls of a besieged city, and his own Nordic troops gave him a new name for it, Talos, meaning Storm Crown. From there, Cuchulainn's forces took Sancretor, then swept up the rest of the Colovian estates within a year, then took the imperial city itself in the year 854 of the Second Era. Cuchulainn never got to wear the crown he'd spent his whole campaign chasing. He was assassinated just before his coronation, under circumstances nobody has ever fully explained, and his general was crowned in his place instead, under a new name, Tiber Septim. Consolidating Cyrodiil itself took a little more fighting first. At a battle remembered as Five Bridges, Septim's battle mage, Zurin Arctus, talked him into holding his real reserves back and letting an early wave of the attack fail on purpose, so that his enemies, lulled by what looked like a won battle, were caught completely off guard when Septim's fresh troops routed an army twice the size of his own. An uprising inside the imperial city itself, the Moth Rebellion, had to be put down soon after by the 3rd Legion, a unit made mostly of Colovian farm boys, who earned the nickname the Faithful after holding out under siege in their own barracks until the rebellion finally broke. From there, the newly crowned Tiber Septim spent the better part of a decade finishing what Cuchulainn had started, province by province, never again leading the fighting personally, preferring to run it from behind. Hammerfell fell apart from the inside before he even had to invade it properly, its Redguard population splitting into a civil war between two rival factions, the Forebears and the Crowns, over who should succeed their dying king. Septim backed the Forebears in exchange for territory. Imperial ships crushed Wayrest's own navy in a surprise dawn raid at the Battle of the Bulsey, and inland, a 3rd Legion assault on the besieged Khajiit city of Senchal killed enough civilians that the battle was left out of the Empire's own official histories afterward. Septim's admiral, Amiel Richton, then crushed the Crown fleet at the Battle of Stros Emkai with the help of a mercenary dragon named Nafa Alilargus. The Crown Prince leading that fleet, Ator, died from a poisoned arrow in the middle of the fighting, and his own archmage sealed his soul into a soul gem and placed his body into a magical stasis, rather than let him die for good, a secret that held for years before it ever came out. Not every imperial victory held, either. Dominion forces caught the 3rd Legion off guard soon after at the Battle of Black Rocks and very nearly wiped it out. What survived became the core of a new unit, the Ruby Legion. And when the Redguard siblings Cyrus and Izara stormed the provisional governor's own palace in Strozem Kai, and the Forebear baron named Volag retook the city of Sentinel in a rebellion of his own, both Redguard factions turned around and rose up against Septim's occupying garrisons entirely, forcing him to sign a more generous treaty, the First Treaty of Strozem Kai, just to hold on to the province at all. Generations later, Redguards would still describe what that treaty made them in blunt terms: part of the empire, but not a subject of it. Elsewhere, and Valenwood, already weakened and squabbling among themselves, fell in turn, though the Khajiit would go on resenting it for a long time after. Black Marsh's outer edges came under imperial control, but its interior swamps were never worth the trouble of a real invasion, and Septim's generals were smart enough to know it and simply left the deep marsh alone. Morrowind was the province everyone expected to be the hardest fight of all, and it barely fought back. The Tribunal, the three living gods who had ruled the Dunmer since the Battle of Red Mountain, were far weaker than anyone outside Morrowind realized. Dagoth Ur, the same Vorin Dagoth whose house had been branded traitors after that ancient battle, had returned from wherever he'd been hiding and cut the Tribunal off from the heart of Lorkhan, the very source of their divine power. He had spent his hidden centuries building an army of his own out of a disease called the Blight, twisting the Dunmer it touched into ash creatures and worse, and working toward a second brass god to replace the one Tiber Septim was about to take. None of that showed on the surface yet. What showed, to an imperial army sizing up the province, was a tribunal that could no longer back up its own reputation. Before Vivec ever offered peace, imperial legions sacked the city of Mournhold outright, wiping out its royal family in the process and sparing only a 5-year-old heiress named Baranzaya, who grew up to sit a very different throne decades later, as Queen of Wayrest. Facing an imperial army, they no longer had the strength to fight the way they once could have. Vivec offered peace instead. The resulting treaty, the Armistice, was remarkably generous to Morrowind, letting the Dunmer keep their own religion, their own laws, and even their ancient right to own and trade slaves. In exchange, the Empire got access to Morrowind's rich ebony mines, and one other thing, Numidium, the Dwemer's brass god, handed over by Vivec himself. Numidium is its own long story, one better told elsewhere in full, but the short version matters here, because it's the reason the rest of the conquest happened as fast as it did. The Dwemer had built it centuries earlier, a construct roughly 1,000 feet tall, meant to be powered by the heart of Lorkhan, and meant to make its builders into gods. They vanished before they ever switched it on. Tiber Septim's battle mage, Zurin Arctus, spent years getting it working again, without the original heart, using a substitute power source built from a sacrificed soul instead, and once it was running, Septim used it to finish the job. He activated Numidium near the city of Rimmen in Elsewhere and marched it against the Aldmeri Dominion, whose navy had until then been the one force in Tamriel still strong enough to make him hesitate. The capital of Alinor fell to Numidium within a single hour. Every known activation of that machine, before this one and after it, comes with the same strange side effect attached. It doesn't just win battles, it distorts time itself, in ways nobody has ever fully explained. Tiber Septim won the last province he needed for a unified Tamriel using a weapon whose side effect is damage to time. That's not a metaphor. That's what the record says happened, and it's a big enough claim on its own without needing embellishment. With Alinor's surrender in the year 896 of the Second Era, the war that Culhwch had started 44 years earlier was finally over, and for the first and only time in its recorded history, the whole of Tamriel stood unified under one ruler. Tiber Septim died in the year 38 of the Third Era, and most of Tamriel came to believe he ascended to godhood in death, becoming Talos, the ninth of what had been the 8 divines. That transformation, and everything it meant for the religion that grew up around it, belongs to a story about gods, rather than a story about wars. What belongs here is simpler. The Third Empire that came out of all this started with 2 things stacked on top of each other, a machine built by a vanished race of gods and a mortal man who became a god himself. The rest of the Third Era is the story of that empire slowly coming apart at exactly those 2 seams. 12 years into the reign of Emperor Antiochus Septim, in the year 110 of the Third Era, the Marmor of Piandonea made their closest attempt in recorded history at actually taking a piece of Tamriel for themselves, and it happened at Somerset. The Maormer, sometimes called the Sea Elves, had tried to invade the Somerset Isles before, going back further than anyone kept clean records for. This attempt was led personally by their king, Orgnum, and it was serious enough to draw in both the Third Empire and the Sigic Order of Artaeum, the reclusive mages who almost never involved themselves in anything happening on the mainland. There's a detail attached to the lead-up to this war that needs a flag on it before it goes any further. An in-world book called The Wolf Queen, written by an author named Joachim Jarth, claims that 3 months before the fighting started, after Orgnum had already declared war, Queen Potema of Solitude met privately with him for dinner at the Blue Palace, and that she met with the Sigic Order and the Right Master that very same morning. That detail comes from a work of historical fiction, not a historical record. Jarth himself said he interviewed veterans of the war for his book and left out details he suspected were exaggerated, which is an honest way of admitting the whole thing is part reconstruction and part storytelling. So, the dinner with Orgnum and whatever scheming Potema may or may not have been doing that day gets told here exactly the way it survives, as a claim from a novel, not as settled history. But Potema does have a real war attached to her name a few years later, and this part comes from the historical record rather than the novel. When her niece, Quintira II, took the throne over Potema's own preferred claimant, her son Uriel, Potema coordinated 3 separate attacks on the empire at once, in High Rock, in Morrowind, and a siege of the imperial city itself, which fell after 2 weeks, and let her son crown himself Emperor Uriel III that same night. The war that followed, remembered as the War of the Red Diamond, dragged on for years between Potema's forces and her own younger brothers. It ended in the year 127 of the Third Era, when Uriel III was captured in Hammerfell and burned alive inside his own prisoner's carriage by a mob before he ever reached trial. Potema did not stop there. For 10 more years she fought on alone, using necromancy to raise her enemies' own dead against them and turning Solitude, by every account, into a city that felt like a tomb. She finally made her last stand there, holding out for a month with an army of the undead, and died in the siege at the age of 70. That siege is where she earned the name history still calls her by, the Wolf Queen. The war itself is better attested. An alliance between the kings of the Somerset Isles and the Third Empire stood together against Orgnum's fleet, and by most accounts they were losing. The combined Imperial Navy and Somerset navies simply couldn't hold against what Orgnum had brought with him. Then, with the battle apparently already decided, a sudden and violent storm appeared off the coast of Artaeum, the Sigic Order's home island, and annihilated the Marmor fleet outright. Legend credits that storm to the Sigics themselves, and over time that's simply become the accepted explanation, though nobody outside the Order has ever confirmed exactly what they did or how. Whatever caused it, the storm broke Piandonia's ambitions for a long time afterward. It was so violent that Orgnum could never rebuild a fleet strong enough to try again, made worse by the fact that he lost a magical coffer in the fighting, one that had been the sole source of his personal, apparently limitless wealth. Without it, he couldn't afford to rearm the way he once had, and Piandonia's naval power never fully recovered. As of a few centuries later, this remained the last documented Marmor appearance in Tamriel at all. The war was remembered as the greatest victory of Antiochus Septim's reign, and one of its veterans, a man named Amiel Lanus, went on to found the Knights of the Nine an order dedicated to recovering a set of relics tied to the old hero Pelennor Whitestrake. More than a century later, a different threat came out of Valenwood, and this one didn't get stopped by a storm. It got stopped by an alliance of local kingdoms doing a job the Empire itself should have been doing. Haemon Camoran started out as an advisor and sorcerer serving a man named Kaltos, a claimant to the Camoran throne that ruled Valenwood. Camoran was good at his job, good enough that his own campaigning helped Kaltos take eastern Valenwood. Then he turned on the man he served. The two fell out over Camoran's continued campaigning into Colovia, which Kaltos didn't approve of, and rather than back down, Camoran simply took the throne he'd been fighting for on somebody else's behalf and made it his own. From there, he earned the name history remembers him by the Camoran usurper, sometimes called the Heart King. What followed was 13 years of one man tearing through the western half of Tamriel, with an army that, by most accounts, was built out of mercenaries, the undead, and Daedra. He conquered most of Hammerfell, defeating the kingdoms of Rihad and Tanith at the Battle of Dragontooth along the way. He sacked the city of Kuach so brutally that even Kaltos, his former lord and now sworn enemy, was disgusted by the violence against civilians. He pushed into High Rock, where 8 local lords, remembered afterward as the 8 traitors, actually allied with him rather than against him, seeing him as a useful weapon against the Empire they resented more than they feared him. He got this far, tearing through 4 regions of Tamriel, more or less unopposed by any real imperial resistance, for one simple reason: the Empire wasn't fighting him. Emperor Sepphoris II was tied up for the entire span of Camoran's rampage in a civil war of his own, fought against a rival cousin named Andorak over the imperial succession, a dispute that consumed every resource he might otherwise have thrown at the invasion. He tried sending mercenaries west to slow Camoran down, and Camoran simply bribed them to switch sides. The Empire's reputation in its own western provinces took lasting damage from how little it managed to do. It was the local kingdoms of High Rock, not the Empire, that finally stopped him. Their own internal politics kept them from coordinating well at first, but Baron Othrok of Dwynnen, who had already made his own name defeating a supernatural horde called the Nightmare Host at the Battle of Whitemore before the usurper ever became his problem, managed to hold Camoran's armies at bay near his own territory. By the year 267 of the Third Era, the combined forces of several High Rock kingdoms had put together what's remembered as the greatest navy Tamriel had seen assembled up to that point. At the Battle of Firewaves, that combined navy and its land forces met the usurper on the coast near Dwynnen and killed him, ending his invasion for good. The weather itself seemed to turn against him in that final battle, something people at the time simply chalked up to divine intervention. The same day he fell, his mistress gave birth to a son, Mankar Camoran, who would grow up to lead a very different war against a very different empire more than a century and a half later. The lesson here isn't that the Empire was too weak to stop the Camoran usurper. It's that the Empire was somewhere else entirely, fighting itself over a succession dispute while an entire war played out on its own western doorstep. The Empire wasn't beaten, it was distracted, and the distinction mattered enormously to the people of Valenwood, Hammerfell, and High Rock, who had to fight the usurper themselves, while Cyrodiil looked the other way. Tamriel tried going the other way only once. In the year 288 of the Third Era, Emperor Uriel Septim V capped 20 years of preparation with an invasion of Akavir itself, and actually took 2 of its cities, naming them Septimia and Ionith after his own line. It did not last. By 290, his whole army had been destroyed at the Battle of Ionith, and Tamriel has not seriously tried to invade Akavir again since. The two continents have had almost no contact with each other in the centuries since that defeat. A little over a century later, the empire found itself distracted again, only this time, nobody outside the imperial palace even knew it was happening. Before any of that betrayal, Uriel Septim VII had already spent over a decade as an active, expansionist emperor, pushing imperial influence hard into Morrowind and Blackmarsh provinces, where that influence had always been thin. He made a talented battle mage named Jagar Tharn his own imperial battle mage in the year 376 of the Third Era, and leaned on the man's counsel through years of what one account calls a mix of military intimidation and diplomatic accommodation. It was that same trusted advisor who turned on him 13 years later. In the year 389 of the Third Era, the imperial battle mage, Jagar Tharn, betrayed Emperor Uriel Septim VII, imprisoned him somewhere in oblivion, and used illusion magic to take his place on the throne. For 10 full years, the man ruling the Third Empire wasn't the emperor at all, it was his own battle mage wearing his face. Imperial authority, unsurprisingly, went into decline the whole time, and the provinces, sensing weakness even if they couldn't name its cause, started fighting each other again. 4 of those provincial wars are worth naming quickly, because together they paint a clear picture of an empire fraying at every edge while its throne sat occupied by a fraud. The Arnesian War broke out in the year 396, when a Dunmer trader was captured, tortured, and killed by Argonian rebels in the southern reaches of Morrowind. Morrowind declared war on Blackmarsh over it and won, expanding its own territory south in the process. The War of the Bendermach started the following year among Hammerfell, Skyrim, and High Rock, and ended with Skyrim seizing land and cities from both of its rivals, reopening old grudges the Redguards in particular never really let go of. A war, fought between the Bosmer of Eastern Valenwood and the Khajiit of Elsewhere, dragged on for 4 years and 9 months, so close to 5 full years that people simply started calling it the 5-Year War. And it ended with Elsewhere expanding its own border west at Valenwood's expense. And while Valenwood was still losing that fight, its old ally Somerset turned on it too, in the War of the Blue Divide, taking a string of Valenwood's coastal islands and burning its harbors, timed so precisely against Valenwood's other war that the Bosmer ended up fighting the Khajiit and the Altmer at once. None of these 4 wars is well documented beyond the bare outline of who fought whom and who came out ahead. But that bare outline is the point. This was an empire coming apart in pieces, province against province, while the man on its throne wasn't even real. The same decade of chaos let something worse than a provincial border dispute slip through, too. Daedric legions, loyal to Mehrunes Dagon, invaded the Imperial Battlespire, a fortress and proving ground for Imperial battle mages, slaughtering the mages stationed there and cutting the place off from any reinforcement out of Cyrodiil. It took a lone apprentice from the Battle College to end it, banishing Dagon back to oblivion and shattering most of the fortress in the process. The Empire rebuilt what it could afterward, but the ruined half of Battlespire and the breach that had let Dagon's own army through in the first place stayed closed for good. It was a small preview of the kind of danger this same Daedric prince would bring against the whole of Tamriel a few decades later. The imposture ended in 399, when the true emperor was finally freed and Jagar Tharn was defeated, but the damage to imperial authority didn't heal overnight, and the fractured, resentful state the provinces were left in didn't fully resolve for almost 2 more decades. What finally resulted in the year 417 of the Third Era is one of the strangest events in all of Tamriel's history, and it happened over the Iliac Bay, the tangled patchwork of dozens of independent city-states and petty kingdoms sitting between High Rock and Hammerfell. It started with a king's murder that nobody recognized as murder at the time. King Lysandus of Daggerfall died in the year 403 of the Third Era, and his death went unquestioned until an agent of the Blades, sent 2 years later by Emperor Uriel Septim VII to look into it, uncovered the truth. A lord named Woodborne had arranged the killing to seize power, working together with Lysandus' own son, Gothrid, who took Daggerfall's throne in his dead father's place once the deed was done. That same investigation turned up an old artifact called the Totem of Tiber Septim, which the Blades agent recovered from Gothrid once his part in the plot came to light. Whoever held that totem, it turned out, could control something built centuries earlier and thought lost for good. Numidium, the same brass god Tiber Septim had used to finish his own conquest, and which had supposedly been destroyed after that conquest was done, turned out to still exist in pieces, and those pieces had been reassembled over the following centuries. An artifact called the Totem of Tiber Septim, the only thing capable of controlling the golem, had also resurfaced, and multiple rival powers around the Iliac Bay each wanted it for their own reasons. 3 warring kingdoms wanting to crush their neighbors, a necromancer wanting to use its power source to become a god, an undead battle mage wanting to finally die properly, an orc warlord wanting a homeland for his people, and the emperor's own agents wanting to restore imperial order over the whole fractured region. What happened next is not something anyone has ever fully explained, and it isn't a gap in the record either. It's a dragon break, a genuine, documented tear in the normal flow of time, and it is meant to be strange rather than a mistake somebody forgot to iron out. Over the course of 3 days, the 9th through the 11th of Frostfall, it appears that every single one of those rival claimants got hold of the totem and activated Numidium, simultaneously, each in their own version of events, each one achieving their own goal. 7 armies clashed in battles that, by any ordinary accounting of time, could not possibly have all happened in the same 3 days across the same region. Before that, Frostfall, the Iliac Bay held some 44 separate, squabbling city-states and kingdoms. After it, there were 4: Sentinel, Wayrest, Daggerfall, and Orsinium, each one larger and more stable than anything that had stood there before, and all of them, somehow, sworn loyal to the Emperor. This is sometimes called the Second Numidian Effect, a nod to the fact that every known activation of that golem seems to break time a little on its way out. Some came to call the whole event the Miracle of Peace, because for all its impossible contradictions, what it actually left behind was decades of stability in a region that had never known any. The Blade's own agents, scattered across the Iliac Bay when it happened, reported experiences that line up with nothing except each other's strangeness. One agent, buried by a sandstorm that came out of a clear sky south of Bergama, dug himself out and walked all day to the next town, only to find he had somehow lost an entire day doing it, arriving on a date that should not have been possible yet. Another agent, working undercover near the Hrothgarian foothills, described feeling a wave of heat pass behind her, and when she turned to look, her eyes were simply burned out of her skull. Nobody who studies it claims to fully understand how contradictory outcomes all became equally true. It's simply what the record says happened, and the record is comfortable admitting it doesn't make ordinary sense. The 4 kingdoms that came out of it held their new borders for good. Sentinel grew to cover the whole northern coast of Hammerfell under Lotun, son of Queen Akoreti, a king remembered for holding onto Yokuda's old ways while still keeping faith with the modern empire he answered to. Juarez spread across the eastern coast of the bay under Queen Elisana. Daggerfall came to hold most of western High Rock under King Gothrid and Queen Aukkai. And Orsinium, the same kingdom that had been burned to the ground once already after a 30-year siege centuries earlier, finally got the standing it had never been given before. Within 10 years of the warp, Orcish citizens could be found across the empire in every walk of life, and King Gortwog proved himself enough of a diplomat that Nova Orsinium held its ground this time and kept it. By the late Third Era, the region that had once held 44 separate rulers fighting each other had none left to fight. 16 years after the miracle of peace settled the Iliac Bay, in the year 433 of the Third Era, the Septim dynasty ended in a single day. Emperor Uriel Septim VII and every one of his known sons were murdered one after another by a secretive Daedra-worshipping cult called the Mythic Dawn. What followed is remembered as the Oblivion Crisis, sometimes the Great Anguish, and it came closer than anything else on this list to ending Tamriel outright. Nobody has ever pinned down exactly where the Mythic Dawn came from or how long it had been organizing before it struck. What survives of its own writings claims something stranger than an ordinary plot for a throne. The cult believed Tamriel itself was actually a plane of oblivion belonging to the fallen god Lorcan, and that the divines had been propping up a lie about the world ever since they killed him. Its patron, the Daedric prince Mairunis Dagon, was going to tear that lie down and hand his followers a paradise of their own. Whether the cult's own members truly believed any of that, or whether it was just a story their leader, Mankar Camoran, used to recruit killers, isn't something anyone can settle from what's left behind. Mankar Camoran himself was the same infant born the day the Camoran usurper fell in battle, raised in hiding afterward, and eventually handed a Daedra-authored book, the Mysterium Xarxus, by Meirun's Dagon in person. Whatever he found in its pages, he used it to bind himself to Dagon and build a private realm of his own, which he called Paradise. What's certain is what he and his followers did next. With Uriel Septim dead and no crowned heir left to sit the ruby throne, the ritual that had protected Nirn from oblivion for centuries, the lighting of the dragonfires, couldn't be performed. The barrier between the two worlds began to fail, and oblivion gates, stable doorways straight into Meirun's Dagon's realm of the Deadlands, started opening across the continent. Every gate that stayed open weakened the barrier further, and if enough of them had stayed open long enough, Nirn and Oblivion would eventually have become the same place. Whole provinces felt it. Daedra besieged Skyrim and tore through its old holds. In Cyrodiil, the city of Kuach was destroyed outright, burned down, while what was left of its people held out in the chapel at its center. In Black Marsh, the Histries called their scattered Argonian children home to fight, and the Argonians would later say it took a counter-invasion of their own, straight into the gates themselves, to finally shut the Daedra out of that province. Cyrodiil's own capital was left close to defenseless the whole time. High Chancellor Okato said so himself. At the time, Cyrodiil and cities like Bruma had nothing to spare, because he neither could nor would pull troops out of the other provinces to protect the center. A later account out of Morrowind claims the opposite happened there, that Imperial troops were in fact withdrawn from that province during the crisis, but that claim runs straight against Okato's own words from the same period, and there's no way now to say which version is right. One heir was still alive, and for most of the crisis, nobody, including him, knew it. Martin Septim was Uriel's illegitimate son, raised in secret and grown into a priest of Akatosh in Kuach. With no idea, his father sat the throne until the night the Mythic Dawn came for the rest of his family. Blade's agents found him in the ruins of his own besieged city and got him to safety. And from there, helped by an agent remembered only as the hero of Kuwach, Martin spent what was left of the crisis trying to recover the one object that could still relight the dragon fires, the Amulet of Kings, which the mythic Dawn had already stolen. The hero of Kuwach tracked it into Munkar Cameron's own private realm and fought it back out again, and with the amulet finally in hand, High Chancellor Okato proclaimed Martin the new emperor. Martin never got crowned. Before the ceremony could happen, Mehrunes Dagon threw everything he had left at the imperial city directly, tearing open gates across the whole capital and manifesting there in person, a red, four-armed giant standing in the heart of Tamriel. Martin fought his way to the Temple of the One and did the only thing left that could stop him. He shattered the Amulet of Kings. Its power tore through him and turned him into an avatar of the dragon god Akatosh, and in that form he drove Mehrunes Dagon back into oblivion for good. The Nords would later tell it as Akatosh himself striking Dagon down. The Thalmor, of all people, would later try to claim some credit for ending the crisis too. Neither version changes what the plain record says. Martin Septim, last of his bloodline, gave his life to close the gates, and the barrier his death sealed has never been forced open again, not even briefly, not even by the kind of artifact that used to be able to tear a hole in it on its own. That sacrifice ended the Oblivion Crisis and ended the Third Era along with it. It left a permanent mark on how ordinary people across Tamriel thought about Daedra and dark magic afterward, especially in hard-hit places like Skyrim, and the New Order, the Vigil of Standar, was founded specifically to hunt down Daedra and the cultists who summoned them, so that nothing like this crisis could ever start quietly again. It also left the empire it saved in ruins. The Septim bloodline was gone entirely. Most provinces had already been restless before the invasion even started, and with no heir and no dynasty left to hold anything together, talk of provinces leaving the empire stopped being just talk. High Chancellor Okato tried to hold the whole structure together as potentate, but Black Marsh broke away almost at once, seceding under the nationalist Engelil and renaming itself Argonia, and it used the chaos of a later disaster called the Red Year to invade its old neighbor Morrowind and weaken the empire further still. Okato himself was assassinated in the year 15 of the Fourth Era, opening a stretch of chaos called the Stormcrowned Interregnum that didn't end until a new man, Titus Med I, fought his way into the imperial city and founded a new dynasty in the year 22 of the Fourth Era. In that same chaos, Orsinium, rebuilt more than once by this point in its long history, was sacked yet again, this time by High Rock and Hammerfell together. And on the far side of the continent, in Somerset, an Altmer faction called the Thalmor had spent the crisis fighting off Mehrunes Dagon's own incursions there, and made sure everyone remembered it afterward. The name went back centuries by this point. The Thalmor had first been a minor Altmeri council, tasked with guarding Altmeri heritage, before becoming the governing arm of Queen Iron's own first Altmeri dominion, the same alliance already told about in the Three Banners War. A second version of the organization ran Valenwood decades after that, officially to protect the Bosmer, actually to deny pirates a haven near Somerset's own shores, until Tiber Septim's conquest of Valenwood dissolved it along with everything else standing in his way. By the time of the Oblivion Crisis, the name had faded down to a fringe movement inside Somerset's government that most people barely paid attention to. The crisis changed that. It is the opening that let the Thalmor start climbing toward real power a third time. What they built out of that opening is where the last war on this list begins. The last war on this list did not start with an army crossing a border. It started with a faction using one province's disaster to take over that province, then the next one, then the next, over the better part of a century, until what it had built was strong enough to declare open war on the empire itself. The Oblivion Crisis had left Somerset shaken, and the Thalmor used that shock to make themselves indispensable. Before any of the rest of it, in the 6th year of the 4th era, the Thalmor had already shown what they were willing to do to get a foothold. They stirred up the Argonians of Black Marsh into a full uprising against Morrowind and the weakened empire, a conflict remembered as the Accession War. It worked exactly as they hoped in one sense. Black Marsh broke away from the empire for good, seceding under the nationalist Englil. It failed them in another sense, because the Argonians who won that war shook off Thalmor influence just as fast as they'd shaken off the empires. Wanting neither master, a few decades later, in the city of Sentinel, in Hammerfell, of all places, Thalmor agents massacred an entire refugee quarter of their own kind. Altmer dissidents who had fled Alinor to escape persecution back home, Legion soldiers who reached the scene afterward found the whole quarter burned to nothing, with nobody left alive to question. By the year 22 of the 4th era, the Sapiarchs, who had run Somerset's government, simply handed the Thalmor total control, and the Thalmor took the whole province out of the empire, renaming it Alinor. 7 years later, in the year 29, the Thalmor took Valenwood too, this time in a coup, and out of those two provinces built a new Aldmeri dominion, the third one of its kind to exist. Elsewhere came next, though not by direct conquest. Between the years 98 and 100 of the 4th era, both of Nirn's moons vanished, an event remembered as the Void Nights, and nowhere felt it worse than elsewhere, where the moon a Khajiit is born under decides which breed of Khajiit they become. When the moons came back after 2 years, the Thalmor claimed credit for restoring them through some kind of magic nobody else had ever used, and whether they actually did it or just knew in advance that the moons were due to return isn't something anyone outside the Thalmor has ever confirmed. The Khajiit believed them anyway, and imperial influence in elsewhere faded so fast afterward that within 15 years, in the year 115, the Elsewhere Confederacy dissolved entirely and reformed as two old kingdoms, Anequina and Palatine, both of them client states of the Dominion. By the time Titus Mede II took the Ruby Throne in the year 168 of the 4th era, the empire he inherited had already lost Black Marsh, Elsewhere, Valenwood, and Morrowind outright, and Hammerfell was gutted from decades of its own crowns and forebears fighting each other instead of a common enemy. Cyrodiil, High Rock, and Skyrim were the only provinces left standing on solid ground. On the 30th of Frostfall, in the year 171, a Thalmor ambassador arrived at the imperial city with an ultimatum. The Dominion wanted tribute. It wanted the Blades disbanded. It wanted the worship of Talos banned across the entire empire, and it wanted a large section of southern Hammerfell handed over outright. Titus Mede's own generals told him plainly that the empire could not win a war against the Dominion in its current state. He rejected the ultimatum anyway. The ambassador's answer was to upend the cart in the middle of the imperial city, spilling out the severed heads of every Blades agent the Dominion had been able to find in its own territory. That was the start of the Great War. Two Dominion armies moved within days of each other. One, under a Thalmor commander named Lady Aranelia, marched out of Valenwood into western Cyrodiil, bypassed its cities entirely, and crossed straight into Hammerfell to link up with the second Dominion force landing on the southern coast. The other, led by the Thalmor general Lord Naari Finn, came out of elsewhere into Cyrodiil and took the city of Leawin almost immediately. By the end of the following year, Narifin had also taken Anvil and Bravil and stood at the walls of the imperial city itself. Legions from Skyrim reinforced the capital in the year 173, and for a while the Imperial Navy managed to hold the Niben and Lake Rumare against the Dominion fleet. It didn't last. Dominion forces crossed the river anyway, and by the end of that year had the Imperial city surrounded on 3 sides. The final assault came the following year. The Emperor made the call to break out of the city rather than be trapped inside it, sacrificing one of his own legions to buy the rest of the army time to escape north into Skyrim. The Imperial city fell to the Dominion shortly after, and the Dominion sacked it. One of the men caught up in the fighting was a young Nord named Ulfric Stormcloak, the son of the Jarl of Windhelm, who had left his training under the Greybeards to go fight in the war and was captured by the Thalmor early on. He was tortured and interrogated by a Thalmor agent named Elenwen and told falsely that the information he had given up under torture was what let the Dominion take the Imperial city. It hadn't been. The city had already fallen by the time Ulfric said anything of value, and what little he gave up meant nothing at all. The Thalmor let him escape anyway, having decided a broken, guilt-ridden Nord loose in Skyrim was more useful to them than a dead one. Inside the captured city, Lord Narfin had bigger plans than just holding territory. Working with a Dremora Blademaster named Reeve, who led a cult devoted to the Daedric prince Boetia, Narfin intended to bring about a prophecy called the Culling, using the captive city's own population as fuel for it, and he used a stolen artifact called the Orb of Vaermina to watch the Imperial army's every move and stay a step ahead of it. The same alternate account that credits the Forgotten Hero with the war's final battle also explains how the Empire ever found out about the culling in the first place. It credits a blade named Tyr and the Forgotten Hero with tracking down a sorceress named Laneth, an expert on Daedric matters whom Reeve's own cultists had already kidnapped once for what she knew. With help from an Argonian smuggler named Swims at Night, who they had to fight before he agreed to help them, the two got Laneth back and learned Narfin's whole plan from her. Posing as gladiators, Tyr, the Forgotten Hero, and a legate named Cassia then talked their way into the occupied Imperial city through its own arena, fought their way into the White Gold Tower, and destroyed the Orb of Vermina in Narifin's private study, blinding him to the Legion's movements at the exact moment the real assault began. Down in Hammerfell, the opening months went badly. Dominion troops occupied the southern coast almost immediately, and Imperial defenders were forced back across the Alikr Desert itself in a retreat remembered afterward as the March of Thirst. At least one clear win came out of that stretch of fighting at the Battle of Rosegard, where a soldier named Angarion earned the name Hero of the Battle for holding the line there. From that point on, the war in Hammerfell went better for the Empire than the one in Cyrodiil, mostly because one general refused to accept the situation as hopeless. General Decianus stopped Lady Aranelia's advance cold at Skaven, and when he was ordered to pull his troops out and reinforce the fighting in Cyrodiil instead, he found a workaround. He discharged much of his army as unfit for service, and those discharged soldiers became the core of the force that kept defending Hammerfell anyway. While Aranelia went on believing the real Imperial legions there were still pinned down, Hammerfell's fortunes improved further when forebear armies out of Sentinel marched to relieve the besieged crown city of Hegate, an act that did something the Redguards themselves hadn't managed in generations. It started mending the old political split between crowns and forebears that had defined Hammerfell since its founding. Through the winter of 174 into 175, the Emperor rebuilt his strength with reinforcements pulled in from both Hammerfell and Skyrim, while the Dominion believing the war in Cyrodiil was already as good as won, tried repeatedly to open peace talks. Titus Mede led them believe he might surrender. He was gathering an army the whole time. The counterattack, remembered as the Battle of the Red Ring, breached the imperial city and brought Narifin down, along with the culling he had been trying to complete. One version of events has the emperor himself leading the final charge and personally capturing his enemy. A different telling, passed down by a moth priest named Kellen, gives credit instead to an unnamed figure remembered only as the forgotten hero, standing in for a wounded emperor who could not fight after surviving an assassination attempt. Both versions agree on what happened to Narifin afterward. He was hung from the White Gold Tower and kept alive there for 33 days before he finally died. Retaking the capital did not mean the empire could keep fighting. The legions that had just won the Battle of the Red Ring were exhausted. Much of Cyrodiil lay in ruins, and Titus Mede knew the empire was in no better position to negotiate than it had been at the start of the war. Late in the year 175 of the Fourth Era, he signed the White Gold Concordat, and with it the Great War ended. What the Concordat actually demanded matters more than the fact that it got signed. It banned the worship of Talos throughout the empire. It forced the Blades to disband for good, opening the door for the Talmor to hunt down what was left of them. It handed over a large stretch of southern Hammerfell to the Dominion outright, and it granted the Thalmor the right to send their own justiciars into imperial territory to make sure all of it was enforced. Every one of those terms was already sitting in the ultimatum the Talmor ambassador had delivered 4 years earlier, the one Titus Mede had rejected, because his own generals told him the war could not be won. It got signed anyway, once those same generals turned out to be right. The Thalmor have their own name for this whole war, and it says plainly what they think it was. They call it the First War against the Empire. Hammerfell refused to accept the terms. The Redguards would not hand over that much of their own territory without a fight, and to keep the fragile peace with the Dominion intact, Titus Mede was forced to formally renounce Hammerfell as an imperial province altogether, cutting it loose. Hammerfell fought the Dominion to a standstill over the next 5 years, and signed its own peace, the Second Treaty of Stros-Mukai, in the year 180, which forced every Aldmeri soldier out of Hammerfell entirely. Hammerfell came out of the war independent, badly damaged, and permanently estranged from the empire that had traded away its land to end a war somewhere else. The Talos ban was another matter. Skyrim mostly ignored it at first, and the empire, embarrassed by the whole arrangement, did not push the issue. Then, during the war itself, the Reachmen of Western Skyrim, the native people of that region, took advantage of the Empire's distraction to rise up and seize the city of Markarth along with the rest of the Reach, declaring it an independent kingdom. That kingdom turned out to be a well-run place, its Nordic and Reachmen subjects living together about as well as anywhere else in the Empire, and it even applied to be recognized as an imperial province in its own right. None of that mattered to Jarl Hrolfdir, who wanted Markarth back regardless. He struck a private deal to get his city back. He hired Ulfric Stormcloak and his own Nordic militia to retake it, and in exchange he let them worship Talos freely inside Markarth's walls, treaty or no treaty. It worked. Markarth was retaken, its native rulers overthrown. The retaking itself was not gentle. Ulfric's militia executed captured officials and a number of ordinary Reachmen along with them, sparing few. The Reach's own deposed leader, a man named Madanach, escaped capture only because a Markarth noble named Thonar Silverblood had already thrown him in a secret cell for reasons of his own. Survivors scattered into the wilds of the Reach and kept fighting under a new name, the Forsworn, a rebellion still burning generations later. and then the Talmor found out. Faced with the threat of a second war entirely over one Nordic city's private religious arrangement, the emperor had no real choice. He ordered Ulfric and his militia arrested, an event remembered afterward as the Markarth incident, and Ulfric spent 7 years, from the year 176 to 183, in an imperial prison for it. It became the founding grievance of everything that followed. Hroðr himself did not live to see how it all played out. He was killed by the Forsworn some years later, still fighting the same rebellion his own bargain with Ulfric had helped provoke. After his death, the empire had no more excuses left, and Talmor justiciars were formally allowed into Skyrim itself to enforce the Talos ban directly, hunting down worshippers the empire had previously looked past. The war left its mark on plenty of people who never became jarls or emperors. Cloud Ruler Temple, the Blade's own stronghold in Cyrodiil, was besieged during the fighting, and centuries of its archives burned along with it. The only known survivor of that siege, a Blade named Asilius Bolar, fled north into Skyrim and made his own last stand there against the Thalmor hunting him down. Soldiers who lived through the war scattered in every direction once it ended. Martius Silius, personally decorated by the emperor for his part in retaking the imperial city, became a gladiator in the imperial arena afterward. Some Nord veterans, men like Galmar Stonefist, went home embittered enough that they would later join Ulfric's rebellion outright, while others, like a soldier named Rike, stayed loyal to the Legion and would end up fighting former comrades once Skyrim tore itself in two. An orc king, Durak Gro Batul of Bloodfall, fought the whole war on the Empire's side alongside his own loyal soldiers. All of them came out of the same war. Within a generation, a good number of them would be standing on opposite sides of the next one. Not every Blade died or gave up the order once it was disbanded. Scattered survivors simply went quiet instead, hiding in plain sight for years at a time. 1. A former Blade, known only as the Warrior, spent years undercover in a small town called Rivercrest, waiting out Talmor patrols sent to hunt down exactly people like them. Another survivor, a Blade named Azin, gave up hunting the Thalmor's enemies entirely and went back to the Order's oldest purpose, from before it was even called the Blades, hunting dragons, on the theory that there was nothing left worth protecting in Imperial politics, but the world still needed someone watching the sky. By the year 200, one of the Fourth Era, Ulfric Stormcloak had become Jarl of Windhelm in his own right, and the old grievance from Markarth had never gone away. When Skyrim's High King Toreg took the throne, Ulfric challenged him to single combat over Skyrim's place in an empire that had banned his god and imprisoned him for worshipping it. Ulfric killed Toreg using the voice, and the empire branded him a murderer and a traitor. Some Nords called it a fair duel, fought the old way. Either way, it started the Stormcloak Rebellion, the Skyrim Civil War still going on as of the most recent word from the province, and it traces back through Ulfric's imprisonment, straight through the Markarth incident, straight back to the White Gold Concordat and the war that produced it. The treaty that ended the Great War is the reason the newest war on this list is still being fought. Not every war fought across these 4 eras earned a full stop on this list. Some are barely more than a name and a date in the record, but they happened across the same stretch of history already covered here, and they round out the picture of just how constant this pattern really was. Back in the First Era, while Skyrim's kings were busy conquering Morrowind and High Rock, the Dwemer underneath Skyrim fought a war nobody on the surface even noticed. 4 of their city-states, Arkentams, Radboltar, Betarzel, and Zulft, had banded together to mine a rare substance called Ethereum and built a shared forge to work it. But the alliance broke down into each city-state fighting the others for control of that forge, and none of them ever won it outright. The infighting left the Dwemer of Skyrim weak enough that the Nordic king Geller conquered their cities in just 3 years, something nobody expected given how long those same cities had held out before. Around that same stretch of centuries, in the caverns of Blackreach, the Snow Elves, who had taken refuge with the Dwemer after losing Skyrim to the Nords, were betrayed by their hosts, tricked into eating a fungus that left them permanently blind, and then forced into slavery. Generations later, their descendants rebelled against their Dwemer masters in a long, bitter war fought entirely underground, unknown to anyone living above. It ended, like the war at Red Mountain, with the sudden disappearance of the Dwemer, and the newly free Falmer spread out through the deep places of Skyrim and began raiding the surface world afterward. The war that actually pushed the Yokurans across the ocean to become the Ragada had its own name back home, the War of the Singers. An emperor named Hira tried to wipe out Yokuda's sword singers entirely, and one of them, Divad Hunding, escaped an arrest meant to kill him and became the center of a resistance his own father, Frandar Hunding, was eventually convinced to lead. Outnumbered 30-1, the sword singers won anyway at the foot of Mount Hatu, though fewer than 20,000 of them survived a fight that killed more than 300,000 of Hira's men. Unwelcome at home after killing on that scale, Hunding's survivors sailed for Tamriel instead and became the warriors already told about earlier in this story in the Ragada. Elsewhere had its own First Era war too, though the record on it is thin. The Anaquin conquests, a period of expansion led by a warlord named Darlok Bray, remembered as the Golden Beast of Anaquina, sometime in the 5th century of the First Era. Around that same general period, the Colovians and the Redguards fought the War of Rihad, named for a city in southern Hammerfell, notable mostly because the Colovians briefly hired Bosmer archers and dropped them from service for being too undisciplined. Reman II, the same emperor who later started the Fourscore War against Morrowind, opened his reign with a smaller war first, the Blackwater War, a campaign to seize the northern and eastern edges of Argonia that created the imperial province of Blackmarsh. Early battles went well, but the terrain, disease, and constant raids ground the campaign down into a guerrilla war with no clear winner, and it ended the way this kind of war sometimes does. The Argonians buried their weapons one day and went back to their lives, with no formal peace ever signed. Near the end of the First Era, the Sloth of Thras made their own failed attempt to invade the Somerset Isles in the War of the Uvichil, remembered by the Altmer as a uniquely horrible war for the Sloth's use of necromancy and strange infernal machines. The Second Era's interregnum produced its own scattered wars too. A Reachman chieftain named Durkorach struck a bargain with Mehrunes Dagon and used it to unite the Reach under his own banner, then rode into Cyrodiil in the year 533 and seized the Ruby Throne outright, founding a line remembered as the Longhouse Emperors. A few years later, he invaded High Rock, sacking Evermore and Camlorn and laying siege to Wayrest, and the line he founded held power in Cyrodiil for decades before it was finally overthrown. Around that same period, west of Skyrim, an Orcish state called Yashnag's Chiefdom fought the Nordic kingdom of western Skyrim for more than 30 years, a war so obscure it never even received an official name of its own. Rancer's War broke out in 566 over a broken marriage arrangement. King Rancer of Shornhelm went to war with King Emeric of Wayrest after Emeric married someone else, besieged Wayrest itself, and lost when Emeric's allies, including orcs, promised a rebuilt Orsinium in exchange for their help, crushed his army at Marqueston Moor. Rancer himself was killed by his own general, while attempting a desperate piece of dark sorcery on the battlefield. A decade later, the Calovian revolt saw Duke Varen Achilarios overthrow Emperor Leovich after Leovich legalized Daedra worship across the empire, storming the imperial city and killing Leovich at the foot of the Ruby Throne in the year 577. This is the same Varen Aquilarius whose later, far worse mistake with the Amulet of Kings caused the Planimeld already told earlier in this story. During that same unrest, a noblewoman named Euryxia Tharn, from the same family that claimed descent from one of Pelinal Whitestrake's own soldiers back in the First Era, betrayed her own hosts in Elsewhere in what is remembered as the Frostfall coup, killing the royal family of Rimmon and crowning herself Queen of Northern Elsewhere by force. 18 wars, 4 eras, and the newest one on this list is still going. The Stormcloak Rebellion has not been decided as of the most recent word out of Skyrim, and it grew directly out of the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that ended the Great War. But step back far enough, and that newest war and the very first war on this list turn out to be a lot closer to each other than the thousands of years between them would suggest. The Anwat says Men and Mer both descend from the same shattered people, split into 2 groups that came to hate what the other one had become the moment they found each other again. The Great War was fought between the Aldmeri Dominion, built on the idea that Mer are meant to rule, and an empire of men that has spent 4 eras since Tiber Septim trying to hold Tamriel together. It is the same 2 sides that split apart at the very beginning of this story, still fighting thousands of years later, and a great deal of that fighting has happened in Skyrim itself, the same province where Men and Mer first came to blows on record, at Sartal in the Night of Tears. Nobody has won that fight yet. Nobody has won any of the fights on this list for very long either. Alessia built the 8 divines to end one war, and 2,000 years later, that same religion tore her empire apart in the War of Righteousness. The Servant Truce ended the Fourscore War with a snake bowing to a man and left an empire with no Reman on the throne at all, which is exactly the condition the Second Era opened in. The armistice that let Morrowind keep its independence handed the Empire Numidium, the very machine Tiber Septim used to finish conquering the rest of Tamriel a few decades later. And the White Gold Concordat, signed to end the Great War, banned the worship of Talos, which is the direct reason Ulfric Stormcloak is fighting the Empire right now. Every one of those treaties solved the war sitting in front of it. None of them solved anything else. That is the pattern this whole story has been following from the beginning, and as of right now, in Skyrim, it is still running.